Just to start off, did you know that some wolves have a kind of circular society, so that one wolf is dominant over another wolf is dominant over another one in a circle? Anyway, that's mostly irrelevant, but I just thought I'd start with it as a thing. Right, I'm going to introduce our panelists first. So I'm going to start with Jojo Mehta, to my left, who many of you will know, who is co-founder and executive director of Stop Ecocide International. Next in line we have Mike Robinson, who is the chief executive of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society and did 10 years at Survival International as well. Next we have Jerome Foster, who's a climate justice activist and a Biden White House climate advisor. Next we have Xiye Bastida, who is co-founder of Re-Earth Initiative and a member of the Otomí-Toltec nation in Mexico, which I may have just pronounced very badly. And next in the line we have Alexandria Villaseñor, who is co-founder of the US Youth Climate Strike, an activist and a founder of Earth Uprising. And finally we have Sally Rani, who is an environmental strategist, an advocate, and a co-founder of both Global Choices and the Arctic Angels, which I believe Xiye is also in as well. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is just very quickly say how... Oh, maybe I should introduce myself. Shall I do that? I am Matthew Shribman, and I am one of the co-founders at Aim High Earth, which is an education to action organisation. But enough of me. This is one of the most incredible ideas that I have ever heard in my entire life, and I was kind of going to do a little bit of an introduction to it, but actually I don't think, I shouldn't steal Jojo's thunder. So Jojo, where did this idea come from, and what is it?
Am I doing? Oh, can I use this one? Or should I use this one? Okay. Okay. It's wonderful to see such a full house, and this panel tonight brings together two, actually not just one idea, but two ideas. One of which has been around for some years and has led to what is now becoming a growing global movement to criminalize mass damage and destruction of nature, or ecocide. I co-founded, along with a Scottish legal pioneer and barrister, Polly Higgins, back in 2017, a public campaign to support making ecocide an international crime. Polly was born in Glasgow, so it feels very poignant being here because she's no longer with us. She departed in 2019. And since then, she would be so delighted to see what we're doing now and how we're speaking and who we're speaking with, because this movement has grown exponentially, even just in the last 6 months. Now, we aim to criminalise ecocide at the International Criminal Court for three main reasons. One is that it's the only global mechanism that accesses the criminal justice systems of all its member states. So if the UK, one can always hope, if the UK were to ratify ecocide as a crime there, it would have to include it in our own domestic legislation. So effectively, it's the most efficient way to get a really serious new ground rule applied across jurisdictions. And that's so important with mass damage and destruction of nature, because the worst polluters are often transnational corporations. Second reason, you need to gather a lot of momentum behind this, because you need 2/3 of the member states, and there are 123, to move this forward. There are already 16 talking about it publicly, and another half a dozen behind the scenes. So this is something that is up and moving. Kid yourself not, political advisors and insurers and corporate governance people are telling us this is coming. Okay, but it will take some time because it's being done at the international level. That's what we advocate. Of course, we would totally encourage anyone to legislate for it nationally, but what we would say is take a little bit of time, say that in 2 to 3 years you're going to be enforcing this. Maybe we estimate it could be being ratified at the international level within 4 to 5 years. What that means is that period of time is incredibly important, and And that will come back to this subject of the second idea for this evening, which is the one that's defined this event, Friday afternoon think tanks. Because everybody who's going to need to interact with this new ground rule, and it really is pretty much everyone, is going to need to think about how to do that. Industries, all the different corporate sectors, government policies, education, everything will need to take into account the fact that it's not just a thou shalt not kill, it's a thou shalt not kill thy home, the environment, the world. Because that's what ecocide means, to kill one's home. And that takes time to adapt to, and it takes creativity. And the third reason, which is probably the most powerful one in the long term, is that ecocide helps to create a new taboo. We all know that you can't go to a government and say, can I have a permit to kill 500 people for my new business? It literally won't even cross your mind. It's such a profound taboo. And yet we don't have that same reaction to destroying our Mother Earth. And we should. And the more the apocalypse unfolds around us, which we're seeing everywhere, the fires, the floods, the droughts, the destruction, the more that happens, the more it becomes obvious that actually we need that same taboo to be in that area. And if you put ecocide alongside genocide, you're saying this is how serious it is, and that's really important. And that ultimately brings me to, how do people react to that? How are people going to deal with that? And my dearest colleague, who's at the back of this room, had a conversation with her brother at the beginning of the summer. And he works in big infrastructure projects. I mean, big ones. Electricity substations under the sea, that kind of thing. She told him about ecocide law. And he immediately came back with half a dozen very specific questions. Well, how will that affect our procurement? How about our engineering of this? What kind of cement would we use? How about the vehicles? What about the lads who are doing, so many specific questions? And we sat there and went, oh my goodness, all the expertise that is needed to address this coming parameter is all there already. Every sector knows their own business. All right across society, there's this huge knowledge base that is not being used because we're so used to doing everything in silos from the top down. I had another conversation with a secondary school. My daughter wanted to change schools. I asked them, what are you doing about global environmental crisis? How is this included in your curriculum? And they said, well, there's a little bit in citizenship, there's a little bit in geography, but really we're just trying to get them through their exams. And I just kind of looked at her and thought, what use is that piece of paper going to be when her school's going to be going underwater? I mean, okay, there are places in the world that are going to go underwater a lot faster than my daughter's school, but you get the point. And then I had a conversation with this gentleman here, who said to me, Jojo, if you were going to say to a government, what would they do? How would they budget for moving towards a law of ecocide? What would your budgetary recommendation be? And I thought about it, and I thought, do you know what? Governments have spent so much money trying to shore up the economic sector over the COVID pandemic. They've managed to materialize quite a lot of billions to do that. I thought, what if they just supported every workplace, every school, every law firm, everywhere, to take Friday afternoons, or Friday mornings, whatever you want, to actually think about how they would adapt to this law coming into play. Because all of that knowledge is there. And I said, well, it's kind of like a Friday afternoon think tank. What if, and then I went, oh my God, what kind of a response might this be to the call that is coming from the youth, who are quite rightly saying, pay attention, we're in an emergency, let's behave like it. We're looking at a crisis for the whole of humanity. What's a few hours of your week for everybody to actually address that and think about it? So that is the origin of the Friday afternoon think tank, which maybe doesn't need to keep that name, but that was just what came out. And every time we've talked about this, people have been kind of going, oh my God, well, of course, that's kind of really obvious. Why aren't we all doing that? And so when we were putting our program together for this week at COP, we said, do you know what? We're going to have an event where we talk about this. Because it's just, in the face of everything that we're facing, could be time well spent. Thanks.
It's going to be hard for me to moderate and do all the questions, so I'm just going to do one question and then I'm just going to send the mic on a journey. That's how this is going to work, right? So, Mike, why is this the best idea ever? And also, what do you think about the push for a 4-day work week as well?
Thank you very much. Well, 4-day work week would be lovely, wouldn't it? But yeah, I'm not a great example on that one. I'm just going to start very quickly. I first bonded with Polly before I'd actually met her. Because back in 2009, just after we managed to get the Climate Act through the Scottish Parliament, we wanted to share the international example. We'd got a 42% reduction target by 2020, and I managed to blag a whiskey called 2020, which was 42% proof. And we smuggled it into the G20 finance ministers meeting in St Andrews, and then shipped the rest to Copenhagen and sort of ran around handing it to people. And it turns out that because we didn't manage to get rid of all of it, a case of it arrived in Polly's office in Copenhagen, and they drank the whole lot. So I felt I'd bonded with her before I'd ever met her, but I was very honoured to meet her. She's an amazing, absolutely beautiful and amazing woman. And ecocide is a really obvious idea, isn't it? Anyone who's ever grown up and has a brain realises that we rely on the planet, we rely on the environment. How on earth can that ever be anything else? And I was very disappointed when I first started work and realised that I'd been encouraged to be sort of interested in the environment when I was a kid. And when I started work, there was a sort of sense that I should leave that at the door and come back to it at some time later on. So I guess I've never really grown up. So I think there is a real obvious point in ecocide. It's a sort of way of my sense is until we start to give the environment protection, both through law and through finance, tax, litigation, whatever, it's never really going to be taken seriously. It's always going to be an add-on. I think this is very overdue, this whole principle of giving it some power. So I think it's a really, really important thing to do. In terms of the Fridays, of course it's a great idea. And it's a great idea because we're not taking the time to consider this. This is radical change we're talking about here. We all know that. Business as usual is a dirty word in climate change. And climate change isn't optional. It's not something we can choose to do or choose to ignore or whatever. And I think we're at that point now, and I think we all know this, that we're at a stage where either we choose a path, we still have some choice in the path that we take. So we work it out, we solve some big problems, we stop fanning around. So with GDP, we know that's a rubbish measure. It's Simon Kuznets who invented it and knew it was a rubbish measure, but we still keep using it. We've forgotten that to create GDP wealth, we've destroyed something, but we don't count the thing we've destroyed. If you're digging a big hole to make that mountain, you've still got a big hole. At some point, you're going to fall in it, So we absolutely need to realise this is not optional. We've got to start addressing this, and either we do that in a positive way, an optimistic way, and we start grasping the solutions and opportunities that are out there, or we're going to fall in a bloody big hole. So we need to take some time to think that through, to learn it properly. One of the things I've discovered talking to quite a lot of big business over the last 10 years is how little they understand this issue. The most stark reminder of that was a conversation with finance. There's an international finance meeting in Paris, and there's 9 trillion of disinvested funds on the international market looking for a new home. They don't know what to do with it. But they know now, suddenly, that there's one product that is uninvestable. And that happened over the last 3 years. And I was quite excited to find out what this thing was that they discovered was uninvestable. And it was coal. And I thought, my God, where have you been for the last 20 years? So the thing is, people have got to wake up. They've got to learn about this subject properly. It's so vital. What on earth are we doing that we don't understand it, that we're not clear? And if we don't understand the solutions, we're not all pulling in the same direction. And if we're not all pulling in the same direction, we're not going to get very far. So we've really got to wake up. Friday afternoons, whatever it is, take the time, learn about this. Actually, it's a brilliant lead. You know, what's happened in the last 2 to 3 years, somebody on the front line who's been pushing for this stuff for a long time, it has transformed the conversation, what young people have been doing, because they have raised the bar across the board. And industries and organizations that didn't want to talk to me 5 years ago, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, we're now being asked to come and help. That is the shift that's happened in the last 2 or 3 years. So I sense right now that we have an opportunity like we've never had before, and we'd be very silly to miss it. So yeah, I think the least we can do is take half a day on a Friday to think about it.
So yeah, I want to build upon the question around how do we have a Fridays like mindset where we live alongside nature, and also the second question is about a 4-day work week. I think that thinking broader beyond just an idea of having a Friday where we live alongside nature, I think we have to reframe how we work alongside our economy just as a whole and every single day of the year. Oftentimes right now we're living and like going to work at places where it pulls us away from nature and it pulls us into a silo where we're working on something that isn't actually enhancing our own lives but just enhances the broader system. And it's, oh, thank you, okay. Yeah, so I can be a bit louder. But yeah, I think that oftentimes we are in workplaces where we don't feel enriched and we don't feel inspired, and we have to reframe how we have our economic models to not only focus on the expansion of just economic models that continue to exploit, but actually focus on an economic system that's focused on development. How do we make sure our workplaces develop ourselves and not just constantly this culture of competition? And I think that's the real idea of Friday, is taking a leave of coming back to yourself and coming back to nature. But I think we have to broaden that sense to being every day. How do we make sure that our jobs in general are in the 21st and 22nd century will be more in line with the natural world and how we used to work. And to the second point around how do we have a 4-day work week, I think that I'm taking it from a perspective of a White House advisor, I would per se that a lot of the infrastructure and a lot of like work days and a lot of how do we transform our socioeconomic lifestyle, it's broader than just a 4-day work week, but actually understanding what do people want. They want to really, in this time of COVID, they've had a time to reflect and say, what do I want? I want to be able to be with my families and also be with my friends and also have systems where we can be in movement and be in coalition alongside each other. And that oftentimes doesn't just come from certain policies that we advocate for, but it comes from the values that we hold. And that is where we have to start, is what values do we want to usher in the 21st century? And it's the ideas of diversity and equity and inclusion. And that goes beyond just a 4-day work week. It goes into how do we relate with elected officials when we're in the rooms. It goes to how do we relate with people that don't agree with us on climate change. It goes to how do we enact infrastructure and demand policies that go far beyond just the initial, let's have incremental change, but first let's pitch them the values. Let's pitch them on the leaning in of just commonality. Oftentimes when we meet with elected officials, we start from a position of, you're the enemy. And that's true sometimes because they are the enemy. But often we have to reach them and say, you're a human too. And I know you're wanting the same values I want. So we have to start with leaning in with that sense of commonality and demanding either you're going to step up and ensure that these values are ubiquitous throughout our society, or you're going to step down and you're going to get out the way because young people are here to stay. And we're 100% of the future, and you're continuing to usher in and hold in to the past. And that's what values we have to usher in and what policies we have to advance.
Hello. That was hello. Hello. It's not really working. Thank you for that. Hi everyone. I know we've all had very week already, and mic is going in and out, but I'll try my best to communicate with you some of the things that I've been seeing. And one of the first things is, yes, making ecocide crime is a very big, good idea, because I have seen the exploitation. Hello? We've seen that the exploitation of Mother Earth is what's going on stage where we're so disconnected with Mother Earth that we're not even. Oh. Yeah, she just keep going? Okay, I'm so sorry. But Mother Earth is what's gotten us to the point where we can't really, oh, there's a new mic.
We have a live stream running segment.
Hello? Yeah, hopefully it'll work. If I say hello one more time, please stop me. But, coming from an indigenous perspective and indigenous philosophy, I really like what Jerome said about examining our values, because indigenous values mean reciprocity. It means knowing that Mother Earth gives you so much, and all that that asks is that we give back. And there's also this principle of intergenerational cooperation, of youth and elder circles. There's an African proverb that says, the youth run the fastest and the elders know the path. That Sally taught me. So, yeah, I love that because it's amazing. We are so energized. We want to change the world. We're seeing what's wrong, but we don't often know all of the mechanisms that are around us, how to navigate these mechanisms. And that's why we need to join with the youth movement and everyone who has been doing this for such a long time. And we can't really do that if the foundation of the system that we have is a system that's based on competition and individualism and kind of burning oneself out. And I'm in college now and I studied international relations, and I learned that the principle of how international relations work is a principle of realism. One in which countries strive for money and power, and that's their measure of success, and they'll do anything to get there. And if that's our foundation of how we understand each other, no wonder we are in this mess. No wonder we've had so many conflict and so much war. And we have to switch that foundation to one of consciousness, one of reciprocity, one of not only future thinking, but also going back to who we are, going back to our ancestors, going back to our wisdom. And the last thing I would like to add is that a lot of the indigenous communities who are here, who were protesting today at the strike, they're doing it because they can't protest at home. There's a lot of things that are happening in indigenous communities around the world, and if they protest, they will be attacked by police, attacked by the government, attacked by companies. So they have to fly all the way across the world to come to spaces where protesting is protected, to be able to tell their governments, you are hurting me and you're hurting my home. And that shouldn't be the case. The destruction of Mother Earth and the protection that people are giving Mother Earth shouldn't be what's criminal. It should be the other way around. And we have to do our best to protect those efforts of protecting environmental defenders, because it goes into ecocide, into making ecocide a crime. Because so often we also have this narrative that we have to protect indigenous communities, and we don't understand that indigenous communities have to protect us, and that those values protect us, and those values protect the earth, and those values protect our values. And there's just a way of thinking that I think we haven't had, which is, we are all in today now, and we have so many divisions and so many things that are separating us instead of understanding how we can come together. And if we can come together in making hurting Mother Earth not a thing, I think that it's literally the first step into imagining what the future can look like. Because right now we're talking about how ecocide, like the effects that ecocide have, which is the cession of land, you know, making way for pipelines, making way for mining companies. And thinking about ending that means that we have to reimagine what our future is going to be like. And that creativity is that creativity is things that we are bringing as youth. And we want to have those possibility of have those dreams and that possibility of building the future and not just fighting for it. So thank you.
Well, hi everyone. I hope that your week is going well. I don't know about you, but things have been so busy, and I didn't notice before, but before the pandemic began, I used to travel all the time to different countries, to different cities, to talk about climate change and raise awareness. And one thing that happened is I would never actually take time to connect with nature when I was doing that because I was so busy working and I was so busy focusing on what I was doing. And I always felt like I was never doing enough. But now I've noticed just how important it is to reconnect with nature. And actually, right before this was the first time I've ever gone to a place and actually reconnected with nature. I got to see Loch Lomond and Loch Ness, and it was great because it reminded me what I was doing this for. I think that sometimes we get so disconnected with what we're doing with it, which exactly what you were saying. We get so focused on talking about the environment and saying we have to protect it that we don't actually end up going into the environment and actually experiencing it. And so I was having a conversation recently with a friend of mine, and she was maybe 10, 15 years older than me. And so she was talking about how she has gotten to experience so many different species and biodiversity and the environment on this planet. And she was saying how sad she was that future generations won't be able to experience the environment the same way that she has. And it was so interesting hearing her talk about that because she comes from the generation before me, and I'm in the generation after her thinking the exact same thing. So I'm in California, and every year I'd get so excited to see the monarch butterflies because California has one of the largest population of monarch butterflies. And you know, when I was younger in elementary school, I'd always get so excited seeing them fluttering around the parks, and it just made me so happy because they were just a big part of me. And so now the butterflies, the monarch butterflies in California, the population has drastically decreased. They're actually close to being functionally extinct. And that's because of the jet stream and when they're migrating, because of the weather patterns and how the seasons are getting warmer, it doesn't tell them when they have to migrate. So sometimes they don't get there in time, and so that's how they're dying off. And it's so sad because I want the next generation to be able to experience the monarch butterflies. And in California, one thing that got me involved was the California wildfires. And the wildfires, they burn the forests, they burn the homes, and redwood trees too. Actually, did you know that redwood trees, I recently found out that, I mean, they're huge and they only have 4 to 5 inch roots. And the reason why that they stand so tall is because they rely on each other. They lean on each other. And I feel like that resembles a lot of us too, is that we have to rely and lean upon each other to get through this movement. And that's why I'm so excited to be here with so many young people who are so passionate about this, because we're like the redwood trees. We rely on each other and we lean on each other. And so movements are so important when we're all working together. And so I'm really excited to see us get reconnected with nature and, like trees, rely and work with each other.
That was beautiful. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for comments and your perspective. Something that just came to me while everyone was speaking is that who talked about systems, that the system, I think it was you, Jerome, that we have to ask ourselves the question, where does the ecocide come from? And in that, there are a few different answers. One is we've been taught competition. We've been taught scarcity. We have not given ourselves the opportunity to limit growth to serve all of us. We have an original knowledge we're all born with, which is similar, the same as what Indigenous are teaching us. We know about whole systems. We know about giving back when we take, but we're not doing it. And why are we not doing it? Because we've been, that original knowledge, which is tender and soft and needs to be nurtured in young people, has been polluted in most of the societies today, has been polluted by education, by consumerism, by unethical behavior that often now is sanctioned. And so the ecocide legal framework is actually, what it's doing is it's asking us to look at our behavior in a way as a one humanity in a whole system perspective, and also looking back 7 generations and looking forward 7 generations. Because we are so focused on our political cycles instead of the cycles of nature. And so our decisions are fast and quick, and 4 years, 2 years, 6 years. You don't hear very many people talk about a 20-year plan, who's in, someone who is in Parliament or in Congress, and that's what nature needs. E.O. Wilson, who's a phenomenal biologist, he came up with half Earth. And half Earth is that half of the Earth still can be protected if we do it now. And so the ecocide framework, I think, is something that's long overdue, long overdue. In 1972, I don't know if you guys know this, but in 1972, there was a movement around ecocide and bombing. And actually, the guy that came up with the name ecocide developed Agent Orange, which was the chemical that was used in the Vietnam War to defoliate everything so that you could see the enemy. And so not only the plants, but the animals, the humans were in the way, or they were trying to find cancers, died. I mean, just horrible, horrible stuff. So then you have to ask, well, why are we allowing these things to be created in the first place? So we have to dive really deep in our systems to really figure out how a legal framework can work in the long, long term. There's a situation that I'm going to use as ecocide, and actually ecocide that's being committed visually and actually almost knowingly in the Arctic. The Arctic sea ice is our planetary cooling system, and it's unraveling on our watch. Global leaders have known about this, not in detail, but they have known about this. A lot of what we're experiencing in climate change is because of loss of the sea ice, less precipitation in the Amazon, more fires and droughts in northern Africa. The jet stream that was like this around the northern latitudes is now like this. It's whether you're with live in the United States or not, you know that Texas went into a deep freeze, never goes into a deep freeze on the Pacific Northwest coast. The tidal zone boiled in the heat dome. They estimated 1 billion, and this is ecocide, 1 billion organisms died, from starfish to invertebrates to clams, lobsters, etc. It was a stew, literally. And that has been linked to the loss of the sea ice, because the sea ice reflects the sun's heat and radiation. That is one of our major climate stability regulators. And it's been monitored since 1979. NASA has put this in front of global leaders. They have looked the other way. These global leaders that are here today should be held accountable to that. That is ecocide. And it's also genocide, because so many people are going to suffer. So I think that what you have done, Joe, and Ms. Higgins started so many years ago, is absolutely necessary, because we have to work within the system that we have. And it has taken so much work. You have to ask another question about our systems. Why is it incumbent upon us, just what Xiye said, to convince our global leaders of what they actually know, but they don't want to move on it because they do know this means big change in the economy. It means big, big change. So I think the leveling the field, and there's always an economy of scale that's played here. Is ecocide the destruction of a watershed, or is the destruction of the Arctic sea ice? So I think that this gives us real hope, and I just commend you for doing that. And these young people can take the examples, to go to Fridays for the Future, can take the examples of ecocide. Keep your hands off the Arctic ice. They want to drill oil, deep sea bed mine. They want a polar route across the North Pole. It goes on, And so this helps level the playing field. And the only place that can happen now, because all systems are connected to each other and interdependent, and we are in a whole system world. We're not compartmentalized. And so ecocide addresses that legally for the first time. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's a bit difficult to moderate and ask you questions when there's only one microphone. So what I'm going to do is a kind of volley of thoughts and questions, and then I'll send the microphone on a journey again. Does anyone know the word petrichor? Yeah? Okay, so for those who don't, petrichor is this really beautiful word that means the smell of the soil after it's rained, and it's especially good in like a really old growth forest. Anyway, that's something that I spend a lot of time at the moment chasing down, and before I knew the word, it wasn't something that I really knew how to chase. Anyway, I think one of the most powerful things about ecocide is the word itself, because now we can kind of define it. But anyway, so I love that Sally mentioned E.O. Wilson. I just wanted to kind of say one of the classic quotes from him, which many of you have probably heard before, which is, the big problem with humanity is that we have prehistoric emotions, medieval institutions, and God-like technology. And if we can't close those gaps with education, then we are basically screwed in many ways. So education and training is not something that is a nice to have. A lot of people think of it as a nice to have, but that really flies in the face of the science. I don't know if anyone's looked at Project Drawdown and seen that in the top 5 of over 80 solutions to the climate crisis, education is right up there, especially made fair for so that it's not just for males, as it is all too often around the world. Anyway, I think it's a major misunderstanding of the multifaceted, distributed nature of the crisis to think that we can do this without education, just with a top-down system of carbon accounting. Anyway, so the ideas I was going to throw your way. Firstly, Jojo, in a cafe that you lured me into that had no... I invited you there. Sorry, actually, it's my fault. Had no savoury food, which is why I'm a little bit wired with sugar. But yes, in there you said to me about how nature, when speaking to economists, someone was challenged on saying, "So do you think nature should have a price?" And can you just say what they said? Actually, you'll tell the story much better than me, and then I'll finish my thought.
Okay, so this actually speaks back to the event that we hosted yesterday on ecocide law and financing the future. We were in discussion with, it was an amazing combination of voices there, including Xiye Bastida, who's here with us tonight, and also Ralph Shami from the International Monetary Fund, Katie Hoffman, who is involved with regeneration investment, and myself. And it was a conversation that brought into the room so many different contrasting voices that it was very interesting to see the audience response, of knowing kind of where to put themselves or not. And one of the things that came up and felt like one of the most important things that emerged from that conversation is that, and this is something that really speaks to me actually in terms of how I'm needing to communicate this whole concept and the approach of this new law, is it's a work of translation. We don't have a lot of time to make really serious difference. And we have evolved a system that is very much, that has domination wired into it, that has, extraction and exploitation wired into it, and that is effectively currently primarily an economic paradigm. And so in order to change that, we absolutely, of course, we need to approach things from a really in-depth perspective, but also in the immediate, there's the question of how do we phrase what is needed in a language that can be understood. And one of the things that was really interesting around that was that, this idea that it's not about having the financial world understand the implications of what the economy is doing has to be done in a language that is understood there, and that language is money. And it's how do we actually phrase things and create, have the metrics and the science to have those people who are currently the ones pulling the strings in the world that we currently live in. How do we have them understand that? And what's really interesting about that actually is that, that kind of comes together with something else that I think Mike's also familiar with, which is that in the corporate world there's actually beginning to be a kind of a hunger for a framework. And that sort of combining that with actually valuing what is truly valuable in our natural world. And that's not the quantity you extract from it. That is the intertwined ecosystemic reality of how all of our species and all of our entities in the world interact, how biodiversity, as we call it in the West, is basically the world of the natural living world, how all of that interreacts. And I think, so I'm trying to pull together quite a few different ideas, different sort of threads here. But without a particular parameter that is understandable in that world, and of course, as I said, you're not going to ask for a permit to kill people for what you're doing. And, a CEO last year sort of very clearly said, understand your environmental concerns, but we have fiduciary duties to our shareholders. within the context of what is legal, what is lawful. So what we're saying is, okay, let's change what is lawful, and then that behavior will change. In the same way, if you start valuing the entire system and actually explain to the finance people that that has a financial value, you're not saying, oh, suddenly each thing in nature has a price. What you're saying is, if you don't say that, everything that does matter is ignored by those people. So there's a subtle difference there, but it's a very profound one. So that's really interesting. And I think also what really spoke to me in what Xiye, Alexandra and Jerome were saying as well, is that it is the understanding of the generation who are going to be living in the world that my generation has created, or as infants, is now really starting to impact on those people. So I'll give you a little example. In the UK, which is where Extinction Rebellion started, in fact in the same town that's my hometown, in Stroud in Gloucestershire, those demonstrations that were sort of kind of exploded onto the scene anyway in 2019 the police had to pull in lots of those demonstrations. And this also speaks to the fact that the protesters, and in many parts of the world, the environmental defenders, are the ones that are seen as the criminals. And of course, that speaks to what Sally was saying about reframing all of that, once you say that ecocide is a crime. But my point was going to be that our local police was asked to come and help in London police the demonstrations. And a lot of them, I thought this was fascinating, a lot of them refused. And the reason was that their children were telling them, we don't want you to go and police that. And I thought that was an extraordinary thing to see that happening, to hear of that happening. And, people sort of saying, oh, actually, I don't really want to go and do that, because actually, my son's down at the demo in Bristol today, or my son's over in London, or my daughter's on Westminster Bridge, or whatever it was. So that was really interesting. And so we're seeing the effects already happening, and then the other point. Sorry, I know there's several here, so I've kind of probably strayed completely from what you asked me. Is that the corporate world is catching up fast, and one of the things one of the reasons I think that's happening is precisely because I'm certainly guessing that this is the case, that their own children are asking them, what are you doing, Mummy? What are you doing, Daddy, about all of this? And one of the results, I believe, of that shift in understanding emerged in a statement that was submitted to the COP26 conference barely 2 weeks ago, that was submitted by the International Corporate Governance Network, which is an investor-led network of global asset managers. In other words, it includes all these big banks, and they were asking, I think I mentioned it even, they were asking for ecocide to become a crime. In other words, they were saying to governments, this is what's needed. So that is being called for. And I know that's a really random collection of thoughts in that context. But I just wanted to say one last thing in the context of this, what's becoming a very eclectic conversation, which is that one thing I've noticed over time is that the change makers, those who are kind of really taking action towards making a difference, what is always needed is time, because the values, and I think it was Xiye that was saying this, the values are not hugely diverse. We all value love, we all value fairness, we all value justice. But we spend so much of our time, those of us in the kind of working lives, spend so much of our time just earning enough to put bread on the table for the kids, enough to pay the rent, enough to do the basics, that we don't have that time to align our actions with our values. And the people who do, I've noticed, are either people of independent means or people like myself and Polly who had husbands who just about managed to pay the rent and therefore we didn't have to earn money, not because there was much of it, but just because it gave us a bit of leeway to actually throw ourselves into what we believed. Or you have people who actually work in those sectors, and that's a very small number of people. Or you have people who opt out completely, and they're not a part of the system, and therefore they are able to completely align their actions with their values. So I suppose, for me, one of the sort of inspiring ideas of, and I realise, as Jerome says, it's not enough at all. One day a week isn't enough. But just creating that window of time where people get to align their actions and their values could be incredibly impactful.
Thanks, Jojo. That was amazing, but it also wasn't what I asked you, which is fine. I was asking Jojo about the conversation where, I can't remember the name of the person, but you said that someone was being challenged about, well, should we just put a price on nature? And then that person challenged back to say, well, there is already a price on nature, and that price is zero. And that is the big problem. But anyway, no, I'm just going to send the microphone on one more journey down. But some thought. By the way, if anyone has any questions, do put your hands up as well while the microphone goes down too, and we can pick them up. And please do repeat questions if the audience says them. And I'd love to gather them from the audience, but it's a bit tricky doing it from afar. Anyway, so question number one, focusing on the kind of Fridays idea. Should we take this to a greater extreme? Should we be supporting universal basic income? Would the world be better if there was no pressure to work for money? That's one. Another one is, so Rob Hopkins says, if we can't imagine a better future, then no one will want to take part, no one will want to get involved. And Sarah Goodenough, I know this idea didn't come from her, but she's someone we know at the UNFCCC who's always talking about how we should sell the brownie, not the recipe. So instead of telling everyone about how difficult it's going to be to get there, we should paint a vision of how brilliant the future will be when we do get there. And so how much should these Fridays be thought about as not something for kind of engineer or scientifically minded people to figure out the solutions, and how much should they be framed as actually artists who are painting a vision of what the future could be and helping people to imagine it? And the next question is, you can just take one of these or ignore them all. But so, if an organization is an environmental organization, does that mean they're already doing 5 Fridays? Should they then hand over their Friday? What should they do? And finally, should we be thinking of our design of kind of political structures or this kind of like redesign of the work week, should we be thinking of it as a biological system? And by that, I mean, I always worry about when we design systems by just thinking, oh yeah, this will definitely work, so let's just do it uniformly. Maybe this is something that should be rolled out slowly and with a great deal of diversity, and then we just see how it evolves. Anyway, those are my thoughts. And if there are any questions from the audience, do put your hands up when the mic is being passed, and we'll maybe catch them as well. Anyway, would you like to answer any of them, or no? Shall I? Okay, right. What was the second last question? The second last? About environmental organisations, 5 Fridays. One before that. About engineers and scientists versus artists.
Oh yeah, crikey. I mean, to be honest, I could say anything I like, so there's so many questions. I'm just going to say, I probably will. The creative response, absolutely. There's a massive role for the creative industry that has been very slow to respond in terms of looking at and depicting what that future might be. I actually tried to do a project about 10 or 12 years ago where I was giving a talk to the creative community in Scotland, and I think they thought I was going to say, can you recycle your outfits and use more wood or something? And I said, actually, the problem is that we've left it to scientists to communicate some of this stuff, and the problem is there's only so far you can get by doing that. What we need is to engage more than the head. We need to engage the heart and the gut and the skin and get under people's skin and really properly communicate this and take the fear out of change. Because people fear change more than climate change, which is bonkers. So let's try and depict something much more tangible, more real, much more positive that we can all aspire towards. So we brought together a group of artists and writers and cartoonists and spent a weekend briefing them. The main briefing was basically don't write a dystopian future, and every single one of them wrote a dystopian future. So it doesn't always work, and maybe it was just a bit early in the day. I think if we're going to sort of talk about this space to talk to people and for people to understand climate change, there is a really important point here, I think, and that is it has to be a safe space to talk about climate change. People don't really understand it, even some of them think they do, but they don't, which is sort of ridiculous, considering how important it is. But also, we're not going to get very far if we just demonize or pillory the people that don't get it or haven't really caught up yet. And something I've come across is that a lot of organizations and individuals, they all feel hypocrisy. None of us is doing enough. Every single one of us can do more. There's always something else you can do, and we should always be trying to do that thing. But what we've got to get beyond, if we want to win this war, is we've got to get people on board. And if we alienate people by simply making them feel guilty all the time or hypocritical all the time, they won't act. And actually, I think my sense is that there's lots of really good people out there looking for permission, traction, opportunity to do the right thing. But they're not going to do it if they're pilloried for doing the wrong thing over here. So if we want everybody on board, and we need everybody on board, because even if you just get one politician to agree with you and make some sort of commitment, if the next one doesn't agree with you, they're just going to reverse it. So one of the reasons the Climate Act in Scotland is quite strong is because we managed to persuade every political party they had to back it. So it's not going to suddenly get overturned, So we've got to find a way to create safe spaces for people to talk about this, to get over that sense of holding themselves back for fear of what they're not doing, and start to get them doing the things that they need to do. There was a really, really interesting period. It was actually very soon after the school strikes began in Scotland properly. And 2 weeks apart, there was a school strike in Edinburgh and Glasgow. There's maybe 8,000 people on that strike at the time. And it was really, actually, first of all, it was really radical. It was, what you actually listened to the chants. They're really not messing about, But it was very positive, it was very optimistic, it was future-looking, it was passionate, it was all the things that actually are great. And about 2 weeks after that, there was a religious march through Glasgow in which there was violence, arrests, and it was miserable. A national paper printed a picture of the violence and people punching living daylights out of each other. And under that, they printed a picture of the school strikes with young, smiling people talking about the desire for a safe future. And it said, which Scotland do you want to live in? It was really, really powerful. I sense that under this, we have a huge amount to do. Of course we do, and we really are running out of time. We need to really slow down politics and speed up bureaucracy if we're going to get there. But in doing that, I genuinely sense that this is the one thing, the one shared agenda that we all have, that has genuinely got the opportunity to bring us all together around a positive agenda to actually do something worth doing.
I want to actually tackle the question you had around, tackle the question that you gave to Jojo around education and how do we price nature and how do we actually implement an ecocide into the actual world. And starting out, I want to have a conversation around, a lot of times when we talk as a movement, when they're translated into law, they're kind of lost in translation. And they miss the context and it's misconstrued and it's stripped down to like a really reductive understanding of what we actually want. And this week at COP26, also it's kind of been the same thing. We've had very amorphous and really just beating around the bush conversations around what we're actually fighting for. You talked about this earlier where you said that oftentimes when we talk about social movements, we want to really search for hope and search for creativity and search for this idea of we gotta save the planet. But really what we're fighting for and what people are scared to really discuss is that we're fighting for a real change at the foundation of our society. And whether we're talking about racial justice or gender justice or climate justice, it comes down to the same justice that we're fighting for. And at COP26, there's been so many conversations trying to get to that, but have been scared to really talk about the issues. So I take this time to dig deeper because most of the people here are a part of the movement, but we really differ in our theory of change and how we're going to arrive at the future that we want to see. And this is a time where we can have a deeper discussion about what we really want and how, if we want ecocide, how it should be envisioned. When we talk about ecocide, it is much bigger than just a single occasion in which we inflict harm on nature. It is about a systematic intent to continue to extinctualize or actually harm and ravage the nature that's around us. And the way that we can model that ecocide is the way that we operate as communities and operate as people. In the context of an African person and as indigenous person that Xiye is, we come from that same perspective in that indigenous people have been instinctualized all around the world. They've been driven to extinction. And for African communities, we've been ravaged so much that we're still trying to heal. And that is the foundation of ecocide, is that really we're trying to give space for healing. We're trying to give space for communities to say, hey, this has happened to us. And actually thinking deeper and understanding what ecocide really understands and going back to racial justice is that communities are being extinctualized, being ravaged, and now that we look at nature, it's happening to the same thing. There's communities, there's entire ecosystems that are being driven to extinction. And right now we're having conversations around how do we plant trees and how do we really value nature. But we have to really dig deep and say, why is the world the way it is today? It's because we have continued to rely on a system of ideology that says, oh, well, we're going to value the economic models and let economy trickle into our social and cultural and political frameworks. And that's how the law works. But if we want to have an actual just system and just laws, we have to go into the fact that really what laws that we have today are only working in the European context, because European racism caused so many communities to be driven to extinction. In the same way that our economic models work now is driving nature to extinction. It's the same through line. It's the same understanding. And that's what is a deeper conversation, is that when we talk about ecocide, we have to understand that this is a systematic intent. It's been hundreds of years of deforestation, of burning, and flooding, and suffering. That's what has to change. COP26 brought this movement together from around the world. And all I can think about is the fact that why do we have to be here begging for our lives every single year? And people just don't listen. They just sit and they say words that make no sense out of any other context. They make themselves seem great and inspire momentary moments of great just drive and further reflection, but actually really what has to happen is a deeper understanding that in the next decade we have to mobilize and we have to understand what the foundation of our society right now is based on racism. It's based on exploitation. And it's based on the ideology that indigenous and black people do not matter, and that people of color do not matter, that nature does not matter, that women do not matter. And that is how society is operated. And ecocide is a continual ideology that says that we can limitlessly destroy nature and no one will care. That's the same way that racism happened for so many years, 400 to 600 years, where no one cared until it impacted their economy, when people rose up, when people organized and said enough is enough. But nature can't do that. It can't speak for itself. So we have to be the voice of nature. Indigenous and African people are being the voice of nature because we speak for that which cannot speak against those who do unspeakable things.
I'm going to start the same way I started before, saying that was awesome. And just to add to what Jerome said on that, it's not only that we're speaking for nature, but that nature is speaking through us, because it's that spirituality to nature, that relationship with nature, that is, just trying to emanate across our bodies so that we can communicate with people who are disconnected, that nature has been suffering as much as people have been suffering. And it is, really mind-blowing that we come all of this way. We crossed all of us or most of us crossed the whole ocean to get here. And I actually had a speech at the Leader Summit. And when I walked onto the podium, the room was empty because all of the leaders had left the room. And after, a lot of people know here, I was crying because I was asking myself, the same question Jerome was asking himself, which is, why do we have to come here and be vulnerable for you to respect us? Why do we have to share stories of trauma for you to respect us, for you to understand us, for you to treat us like we matter? Because we shouldn't have to be able to be that vulnerable. We shouldn't have to sell our vulnerability and our stories for just protection to be, an option. But at the same time, we do know that stories move people, that stories touch people's hearts. We know that data and storytelling go together, because without stories, data doesn't really mean anything. And something that I've been asked by a lot of adults is, how do I talk about the climate crisis with my kids? And there's a lot of adults who have 2 or 3 or 4-year-olds, and they don't know how to tell their kids about the climate crisis. And my parents met at the first Earth Summit in 1992, and then in Quito, Ecuador, afterwards in 96 or 94. And so I was raised with my parents knowing about the climate crisis, with my parents fighting for climate justice. And the reason why I got into this movement so fast was because my parents were talking about it all the time, because this was my reality, because solutions were the way my mind was oriented. And seeing all of the damage that was done to my own community, the stealing of water, the stealing of land for mega projects, the stealing of our ecosystems for monocrops, all of these things, you don't really criticize them because you think they're the norm, and we've been raised to think that those are the norm, but my parents raised me differently, and I think that that's what's important. How do you raise your kids? And somebody once asked me a question, which is, when do you think leaders disconnected from nature? And somebody answered, they were never connected with nature in the first place. Because when you're connected with nature, you can't really forget that. And I think all of us have been through those moments where we might have watched a documentary, or we might have gone, to see, like an aquarium even, and you have this moment of wonder. You have this moment of, this world is so beautiful, but you see that one, animal, that one owl, and it's just a glimpse in your mind, in your memory, and it never really, that wonder doesn't persist. And that's the problem that we're lacking. We can't make that wonder last, and we can't make that wonder matter. And that's the problem, that we're not really fighting for the things that are important because we forget that they're important, and thus perpetuate all the systems of injustice, the systems of racism, systems of, imperialism. Because, for half the world has been colonized, and half the world has that pain, and half the world has been oppressed, and half the world has not been able to share their voice. And I remember I was learning about this one painting that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And the man who did the painting had a friend who said, I need to leave the US because in Europe we have mastered nature, and here nature is still wild. And that really hurt me, because how can you think that nature is not part of us? How do you think that we're not part of nature, and that relationship is really what makes us who we are? So yeah, I just would like everyone to take a breath, because my heart is a little feeling full. So breath. And I think that in terms of the 4-day work week, I think, we as activists, as youth activists, we're working every single day, every single second, every single minute. We don't stop thinking about what the future is going to look like. We don't stop thinking about what our next speech is going to be, if we should be sad or happy or upset or optimistic when we give that speech, and that shouldn't be the case. So I think that community is the most important and powerful thing that we have, and if we can have a day for community, and like Jerome said, maybe like every time we have community, that's the most special thing that we can advocate for.
So many great points. So I was thinking about it. COP26. 26. We have had 26 years of the same meeting every single year where people come together for 2 weeks. By the end of it, they're so tired that they can't even think. They're just like, I want to go home. And so people are still even planning for COP27, COP28, COP29, COP30. And we're still planning for when we're going to come together next year and do it all over again. And so it's just like, why aren't we focusing on right now? Why aren't we focusing on the action that we take right now? Why are we focusing on the targets that we're going to hit in 2030, in 2050, instead of what we can do right now? Because when we are taking action, we keep hearing our world leaders say that they have great plans and they're going to be doing great things, but there's still so much more they can do. So anytime someone's talking about actions that they can take, they need to do more tomorrow. They need to make their plans bigger tomorrow. There's still so much more that we have to do tomorrow. We just have to keep growing and getting bigger. And so one of the questions, I think it was about imagination was the second one. And so on imagination, I've had a lot of adults, especially at COP, tell me, when we're thinking about our solutions, let's be practical. I'm sure you all have probably heard it. Let's think practically. And I think thinking practically is what got us into this mess. When you think about what is only politically possible, you put yourself in a box. And you only think about what can possibly be politically possible, and it's always the same conversations about what they think they can do. And I think that's what made the youth movement so powerful, is that we got into this and we were thinking outside of the box. We hadn't been ingrained in a system that all of the adults and the world leaders had been ingrained in. And so we brought new ideas and new solutions. And that is why imagination is probably the best solution for the climate crisis. We have to think bold, think big, and bring our imaginations to the table. And I also think that when it comes to decision-making rooms, we can't keep having the same people in there, the same old white men in those rooms making the decisions, because then we're only going to get the same privileged solutions. And so when we have these conferences, and again, we're thinking about next conference, and it's just like, why are we thinking about the next one when this one is a mess? We don't have the right communities in there. There's not access for those who are most affected by the climate crisis. Observers aren't even in the negotiation rooms right now. And so when we don't have those people in the room, then we're not going to get the solutions that we need, because, again, they're the ones who know what needs to happen, and they're the ones that have to be in the room. And so we need to be thinking about what actions we have to take right now and what we can keep doing better. And we need to bring our imaginations and our creativity to the table, because that's when we're going to get the solutions that we actually need.
Very true. Very true. Well, what I have been hearing, there's kind of three themes here with everyone. One is that we've lost our common sense. Basic good common sense. There's a group in the United States that want to create a common sense political party. Just see how that would fly. I don't know. The other thing is that we have to take our narrative back. So when eco-services were put into economic terms, i.e., that river is a natural asset. Asset comes from the financial world. And so then, because of the way we're trained and our capitalistic system, immediately we think in dollars. We don't think in fisheries. We don't think in biodiversity. We don't think what is the best use of free-flowing water. What is the best use of a watershed? So I think we have to take the narrative back. Another one is pro-life. You know, and everyone here is pro-life on the planet. But that was taken by a particular ideology, and we never took it back. And the third thing is that, well, there's actually four now that I think about it. The third thing is that I think the existential threat on this planet is not climate change. It's not nuclear war. It's the illusion of separation. That we are not one. Not just one humanity, but we are nature. And even our language, when we say our relationship with nature, puts us outside of nature as something separate from. We are nature. We are it. And so if we come from that standpoint, from that knowing, that understanding in every cell of our body, your perception changes. Your actions change on how you are the creation, just as a tree. I slept in a tree when I was very young. I took all my naps in a tree. And instead of going to church. And my mother didn't make me go back to church. I walked out of Sunday school and I said, I want to be there. And how many of you in here have had a really profound experience in nature? Yeah, and that's why most of you are here. And that's why you feel that way. And so I have great hope in these young people that have, and I take this little survey every place I go, you know, with young people and children about their time in nature. And those who are really standing up, showing up, standing up, speaking up, have had that time in nature. So that's another piece that is really, really essential for where we're going. We have to think about that. And the fourth thing, I think, is that we're at a point now, we're right on the cusp of being nature remembering itself. And that, again, raises that original knowledge that we all have, and being reciprocal with nature. So when we have legal frameworks like the Environmental Policy Act or the Clean Water Act, which has been attacked in the United States, similar law in Chile has been attacked. A similar law in Canada, even Canada, has been attacked. When these are seminal laws, the Endangered Species Act in the United States was the first time in in world history that humanity had taken responsibility for other species. Yeah. So the last thing I want to say is that I think in our languaging, one of the things that I try to do is say that I am working for the next generation of all species. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We've overrun slightly, so I'll just see some quick words to wrap up. I heard a great speech from a doctor recently, and they were talking about how they weren't worried about sugar or alcohol or anything like that. They were like, come on, let's be honest with ourselves. This is not the thing that we need to worry about. What we really need to worry about are loneliness, safety, and purpose. Those are the things that really actually matter. Now, it's the kind of top-down thinking that our system always has that results in us just kind of thinking that we should police sugar and alcohol and things like that, when really we should be finding ways to learn through communities and actually find the root causes of the problems. A bottom-up approach is generally much better than a top-down one, and that's why I think the idea of Fridays is such an incredible one, because it would empower so many people to be able to think about many things for themselves. Although ecocide itself is a totally obvious top-down, it's like having skin. Obviously we need skin. Obviously we need a kind of guardrail that protects us from destroying nature. Obviously we need a mechanism where people will be put in the docks in the International Criminal Court if they destroy nature. Anyway, I was just going to comment on what Xiye said about how some people never connect to nature, and I don't really agree with that. I think that all children kind of intuitively connect with nature, and it's actually our system that kind of represses this more than anything else. And so that's what, coming back to the idea of Fridays, I think that if we had this thing in place where everyone was learning, then I think learning would get reinvented quite quickly to something that is much more compatible with a livable future. I just wanted to end on, ultimately, this all comes down to fairness, really, doesn't it? That's something we can all agree on, is that the world should actually be fair. I love what Jerome said about how we speak for those who cannot speak against those who do unspeakable things. Such a good quote. I'm going to steal that one. So thank you all for coming. Do mingle. I know that you didn't get to ask questions, but you can mingle with the panelists, and please do. There is whiskey and gin and nibbles that are all free. And then there's also a kind of soft drinks bar as well. And if you're not staying for the second panel, then do get your whiskey now. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Farewell.